How about now? Oh, that sounds better. Okay. Hey there, everybody. My name is Derek Schatzlein. I'm Director of Software Engineering at HCA Healthcare. I'm here with Jack Mocherman, and we're going to talk today about the Sojourner platform, which is a feature engineering platform that we developed in-house at HCA, written entirely in Clojure. So, agenda. First, since we're a healthcare company, I'm going to touch a little bit on the hospital context, what the data looks like coming from our hospitals and why it's so difficult to use. I'll talk a little bit about the data model that we chose in order to tackle the problems that we face. Then Jack is going to do a little bit of a technical deep dive into Sojourner and how it works and how we use transducers to package up clinical features as kind of reusable artifacts. And then lastly, I'll touch on the impact that it's had in our hospitals. So, the hospital context. What does clinical data actually look like? First off, who are we? Who is HCA Healthcare? HCA Healthcare is the largest healthcare company in the United States. We have over 2,000 sites of care, so that's everything from freestanding ERs, urgent cares, behavioral health units, skilled nursing facilities, et cetera, as well as about 200 primary care facilities or hospitals. We have about 40 million patient encounters per year. These stats are from a fact sheet from 2021, so I assume they've gone up a little bit since then, but we had 217,000 babies born in 2021. We have about 100,000 nurses on staff, and we're distributed all across the United States. Not pictured in this picture are some hospitals in Alaska as well as in the United Kingdom. Now, as a large healthcare company, we're actually well positioned to smartly inject technology into the workflow to help improve outcomes, improve the quality of care, and also lower costs. Some places where we try to inject technology, documentation automation. So a doctor performs a procedure. We don't want them to have to go write hundreds of pages of documentation per week to try to get it all into the medical record. So all of that should flow through automatically into the electronic medical record. Things like real-time disease detection, so sepsis detection, monitoring, infection prevention, all those types of things. Obviously, training models. So we have models in production for predicting things like patient movement. So if I'm in a med-surg floor, am I going to go home or am I going to go to the ICU? Those types of things. And then most recently, LLMs are the new hotness, using LLMs to summarize the patient record in useful ways for our clinicians. We have a department at HCA called CT&I, which stands for Care Transformation and Innovation, and they did this little mock-up of what they think the hospital room of the future is going to look like. And it's very, obviously it looks futuristic looking, but the important things here are it's wireless, there's no ticker tapes rolling off the side of the bed, it's automatically picking up all your vital signs, there's telepresence, everything is automatic. I'm envisioning, like, if you're a big fan of Star Trek, the original series, they got the thing over the sick bay bed that just kind of has the lines that tell them everything that they need to know about you. And that's kind of a strong vision for what healthcare could look like if we were able to smartly apply technology that we have today, even. Of course, all those things require, and if you've heard this before, let me know, data, lots of data. But just any data? Now, we only want the good data, the data that makes sense, the data that's standardized, the data that's usable. And that's actually a bit of a harder problem. Believe it or not, real-time streaming data is very plentiful at HCA. Every hospital, all 200 hospitals, emit real-time HL7 feeds. So if you're familiar with HL7, I'm so sorry. If you're not familiar with HL7, it is a pipe-delimited string format that they use to export clinical data. So anytime a lab is ordered, anytime a medication is administered, anytime a patient transfers from one unit to another, an HL7 message will be emitted that can be picked up to quantify that event. Also, documentation in the electronic medical record is a pivotal part of every nurse's day. Every shift, they're trained to go into the medical record and do screens for things like sepsis. They enter vitals and validate them. The electronic medical record is the single source of truth for everything in the hospital. Now, streaming data is great, but actually making it useful can sometimes be quite hard. And it starts with this. This is an HL7 message. It is, I've redacted all the relevant patient information, but all you really need to get from this is that it's ugly and gross. It's really just a syntax for how data is separated. There's pipes that separate it into fields that are supposed to be certain things, but how the different electronic medical records choose to use the fields is a little bit of the Wild West. So that's the first pain point, is just the source format of the data and how it comes to us from the hospitals. The second thing that makes the data difficult to use is just heterogeneity. I just mentioned that the EMRs all use this HL7 spec slightly differently. HCA has 6 different EMR systems at minimum across their hospital network. We have 3 different flavors of Meditech, there's Epic, there's Sojourner. Some hospitals might not even have the same EMR across the entire hospital, so different units might use different EMRs. There's an EMR specifically for L&D units called CPN, and each one of those abbreviates a medication slightly differently, or uses the ordering system slightly differently, or uses this field this way and this field the other way. And that just makes it difficult to scale something to every hospital in the network. Speaking of scale, the EMR systems emit, and I just did some back of the napkin math before this, they emit tens of millions of messages per day. That's about 4 to 5 billion per year. That's certainly not like the most high frequency event system I've seen. This isn't like a sensor tower or something, but the data is very big and blobby, which makes it very hard to scale with. Additionally, the data modeling. I mean, the data that comes out of the EMR are singleton events. So they are single lab results, single medication administrations. So if you're taking, if you're prescribed hydrocodone, you get it, for each time you take one, you get a specific medication administration. But to make smart decisions about the patient's journey through the hospital so far, you actually need more context than that. You don't just need what their temperature is now, you need what their temperature has been over the past 48 hours to try to determine if they're getting better or getting worse. And finally, this is a live environment. If you've been in a hospital recently, hopefully you haven't, but if you have, they are very busy places, they're noisy places, there's life and death things happening all the time, and things happen. There are mistakes that happen, there are edits, there are retractions, there are on the ground, someone trips over the wire for the Wi-Fi and it's out for the floor, that kind of thing. Just to add a little bit more noise to the data than you might expect. So how has HCA tackled this in the past? I think the canonical solution would just be, well, we have a giant SQL data warehouse. Let's throw everything in there. So HCA does have a gigantic SQL warehouse that they've been plopping all the HL7 data into for many, many, many years. The pro there is you get scale. I can continue to put my data in that SQL warehouse for all eternity. The con is that the data is now offline. So if you want to do something like sepsis detection, where every second counts and you want to have a signal that is up to date to the most recent data that you have, you can't rely on a query that's going to run every hour, or that you have to get try to optimize it, get it down. Maybe I can run it every 15 minutes, that kind of thing. It's just not fast enough. A slightly more modern approach, about 6 or 7 years ago, HCA finished an integration with all their medical records to plop the HL7 data directly onto a Kafka cluster. So if you're familiar with Kafka, Kafka is a distributed event queue. It's great, I love Kafka, I couldn't speak more highly of Kafka. But all the HL7 messages are now resident on, now it's a Confluent Cloud Kafka cluster that scales very well. But all the raw HL7 strings are there. And so the pro, obviously, is that if applications want to consume the most recent, latest, and greatest information from the medical record, they have it right away. The con is that because the data are those singleton events, you lose any sort of state management, or applications are now responsible for the state management, right? So you can't just rely on SQL to say, give me the entire patient history, pull star. You have to maintain the state yourself. I did want to give a little bit of a lip service to this talk actually being a sequel. So in 2018, we came to Conj to present Spot, which was a first draft at using this HL7 stream to detect sepsis. So it was a real-time sepsis detector written in Clojure. It was a handful of Clojure microservices with a Datomic backend that delivered sepsis alerts to the bedside that were then acted upon in all of our hospitals. And a little screenshot of the application here. Some takeaways from that experience. Clojure core is great for manipulating data. I'm kind of If you haven't heard that before, let me know. But I think we just decided that this was the way that we wanted to go for manipulating our patient data. We actually open sourced a library in 2018 called KMap, which is an abstraction for manipulating Kafka topics with Clojure functions. So we used it then, and we continue to use it today in some kind of new and improved forms in all of our services. And the last thing is just building trust. One thing that's very difficult trying to inject technology into healthcare workflows is having the signal be trusted and in a workflow where nurses and doctors and caregivers can act on it and trust it and continue to use it. And so I think Spot was a very good kind of intro to getting a foot in the door there. So just to summarize the problem statement here, our care providers need data delivered at the right place in the right time. And most of the time that is as soon as possible right away. We have many EMRs, noisy data, the HL7 data model that just makes the outbound data difficult to use. And something I'm going to touch on in the next section is to support things like data science and artificial intelligence and all the new things that are coming around. Our data has to be useful both online and at rest. And there's a fundamental disconnect between the SQL data warehouse paradigm and event-driven systems that I'll touch on in the next section here. So what if we wanted to try to tackle all of this data so that we can use all of it intelligently? So a bit of a thesis statement. To build products in the hospital with actionable signal, we need real-time data. But more than that, we need clean, uniform real-time data. Because if the data is different from one hospital to another, it's really not usable. So the first step is to bucket the data into what I'm calling workflow-similar domains. So the HL7 spec, while it is very lenient, there are certain message types that are roughly the same across the board. So things like admits, discharges, and transfers, orders, medications, labs, et cetera, they all roughly use the HL7 in the same way. Some of them have quirky little differences. Some EMRs will have one order for things, and another EMR will have like a parent order that spawns child orders that all depend on the parent and that kind of thing. But for the most part, they're equivalent. More than that, in order to make sense of the data, we need a way to filter it without us all having to go to med school. And there are a bunch of ontologies that can help us do that. Things like LOINC codes. So LOINC is a laboratory coding system. So for example, if I wanted to filter out all bilirubin labs from the data stream, I could hunt down the hundreds of ways that all of our hospitals have abbreviated bilirubin, or I could use the LOINC code, because there's a single LOINC code for labs for liver function. The difficulty there is that the LOINC code isn't actually in the stream, so we have to find a way to merge that into the stream to make it useful. And there are other coding systems, RxNorm for medications, ATC and NDC codes for drug formulations. We have an in-house thing called SciMedical, which does medication mappings proactively. And then obviously a whole bunch of custom ontologies that HCA has developed over the years. Lastly, along with the raw data, we need derived data as well. So if you want to train a model, or if you're working in the AI space, you don't just need raw data, you need features. You need to be able to derive new signal off of the data stream that you can then use to train your models. Developing and validating features is hard and tedious, particularly if you're trying to use two different data sources, say a historical and a streaming source for your training and scoring. And there are some real difficulties that can come from both training historically and then scoring in real time. And I'm going to do a little bit of a case study that is not at all related to a real thing that happened that derailed a model that we trained about six years ago. Let's say that you're training a model to predict unplanned transfers between units. So, I'm in the hospital. I want to know if, I'm going to the ICU or if I'm going home. And the example that I've chosen here is, let's say that a patient has just had a long surgery, 8-hour plus surgery. It's very likely that they're going to be transferred to a cardiac ICU after that surgery. Now, if I go into the SQL Enterprise Data Warehouse, there's a column there for surgical duration. And I look at it, and it's populated for every patient. Woohoo! I've solved my problem. I now have like the most important feature from my model, and it's present for every patient. In reality, surgical length isn't documented until hours or days after the surgery is completed. So it's part of the physician's, physician will sit down at the end of the day and write their notes and document things in the medical record. And so at scoring time, when you really want to know where they're going right after they've left the OR, that feature will never be present. So now data availability actually becomes the biggest blocker to deploying a model in a real-time system. So with all of those in mind, I'm now going to turn it over to Jack to do a dive into Sojourner, which is the real-time feature engineering platform that we developed to use transducers to describe features in our streaming system. So go for it.
So as Derek kind of set us up, we have our problem statement and then the data model that we've taken on to solve the said problem. The material kind of manifestation of that is this Sojourner real-time pipeline that we've developed. We call it a real-time feature engineering platform. AT is the department that it's part of, and as we mentioned, it is just driven by event-driven Clojure microservices, all separated by Kafka queues. Kind of rehashing some of the problem statements and how we address them, streaming data gets normalized across EMRs, so having that consistent data shape is really important so we can apply these feature extractions consistently. We need it to be extensible in that the raw data is obviously valuable, but not enough to build the features that we're going to need to make the outputs that we're looking for. Derived data and features can be injected into the pipeline declaratively. We handle some configuration and mount those as config maps to kind of describe the features that we want to extract using transducers to do so. And then as we highlighted in the case study, making sure that the data in the real-time stream and the data at rest are equivalent, so anything that we're doing with one, we can port to the other without too much translation. Transducers have been instrumental in this, making those features portable and performant. This is the overarching architecture. I'm going to kind of take a step-by-step dive starting from the head and walking through every step of the Sojourner platform. So we start with the EMRs as our input. They're all put onto a single JSON Kafka feed that is structured enough that we can kind of navigate it and start shaping and massaging the data into the outputs that we want. The input that we pull that data off of is called Narsal. It handles all of the EMRs and does its best to normalize those to a single output so all the downstream consumers can perform consistent operations without having to be too conditional or dispatch on the type of data or where the data is being sourced from. The next step in the pipeline is what we like to call the dogs. We do have a good time naming our services usually. Domain ontology generators is what we say it stands for. Basically separating those domains into individual services so we can apply extractions and then hydrate them with the appropriate ontologies. So those ontologies are stored in what we call the semantic API. It represents, ATCs, RX norms, link codes, the things that Derek talked about earlier, but is also built on kind of an extensible schema. So any kind of ad hoc data mappings that we wanted to add, or even internal tooling that we wanted to capture in there, we have access to a database where we can kind of add those at will. The dogs all output to our aggregators. So like Derek mentioned, the raw data as individual units doesn't give us enough to take those composite features or construct them out of the composite patient view of that encounter, the time that they spent there. So in the aggregator, we have collections that I'll talk about here in a moment that both represent those domains, but also subdivide them a little bit and make sure that we can sort and index them dynamically, keeping track of the whole patient as it moves through the pipeline. After the patient aggregators, we output to the feature factories. Like I mentioned, those are kind of driven by config maps that have kind of declarative configuration for the transformations that we want to apply to the aggregates to extract those individual features with. And we'll take a look at some examples of that here in a moment as well. Finally, we have our exhausts. First one is fax machine. That's kind of where we put our data at rest. We're storing it largely in BQ at this point, and that consistency between the way that we store it in BigQuery and the way that it comes out of the pipeline directly allows us to kind of operate in both of those spaces in a similar sense. We also have a few clients which are dedicated to combining features to create some kind of like greater signal, more or less. One of those would be we're replicating the spot signal, so sepsis detection using a combination of features that we can then send off as a more refined feature that represents some larger data set. And then finally, discrete features coming directly out of the feature factory. So we have a few teams that we work with that consume directly off of our topics. So Kafka is really the backbone of all of this. Being able to pipe all of our data down this pipeline architecture, separate it by Kafka queues, makes it really a great fit for Clojure. We kind of think of the Kafka pipeline as a series of transformations, the same way that we think about writing our code as data being transformed over different functions. We take advantage of some of the semantics of Kafka as well, getting the insurance of processing in order and the transactional nature of Kafka as a technology, and also kind of implementing some of our own semantics around transactions, making sure that a single input message gets fully processed before it's output and we don't drop any messages is important. The scale of Kafka is the other thing that obviously comes into play here. The amount of data that we're kind of churning through needs to be able to be supported by a system like Kafka. We're looking at about 30 to 40 terabytes of data per week, and that's a retention period. We have about 250,000 messages coming through per minute, and right now I think our prod cluster is around 120 Kubernetes pods kind of cycling through all of that data. So taking a deeper dive into kind of each of those sections, we'll start with the dogs. So as I mentioned, we have collections that are both those larger domains, but also subdividing into, maybe the patient data itself, what's the name, first name, last name, date of birth, but then what's the encounter information, what part of the hospital are they currently in, when were they admitted, have they been discharged. So with each of the dogs, they kind of are responsible for their own collections. There is a structure that we enforce that we use to aggregate the collections coming out of the dogs. We'll talk about that in the next slide a bit, but the two kind of pieces of responsibility the dogs have are both pulling that data out and then hydrating it with that reference data using the semantic API. This is kind of a small example of one of the definitions we use for the collections. So this would be like showing the patient collection where we kind of highlight that we expect only one value to come out of this, so a single map. There's some other ones that kind of support multiplexing. One message comes in and spitting out more than one output message for a collection. The merge timestamp is what we use to index and make sure that messages are ordered properly. A nice thing about that is, as Derek mentions, because hospitals can be noisy places and aren't always consistent, just going by when the message hit the pipeline isn't always a good indicator of what order the message should be stored in. Sometimes orders are placed ahead of time or retroactively, so being able to control how we're indexing that data is important. The definitions themselves are pretty simple. They're largely paths to the data that map to some output key, but we also support what we call collection key overrides, which are kind of custom functions to address the data in some specific way or do a transformation before we put it into the collection if we need to. Here's a couple examples of the translations from that raw text to the hydrated data from the semantic API. So in this first example, we just have this hydro T5056 term that's coming in. Using the mappings and ontologies in the semantic API, we can kind of pass that in with some parameters and get back all of the information that we know about it, which enables us to have more flexibility and specificity whenever applying filters to pull those features out. We use the second one, ly%, as an example of like really hard to tell what that would be. Apparently that is lymphocyte percentage, but being able to know that confidently and apply that and get all of the associated mappings with that is a huge part of the pipeline. So after the dogs, the data is all indexed and aggregated in the patient aggregators. Like I kind of mentioned, we have the merge timestamps, which are custom and defined however we determine we want that data sorted. And then we also index them based on some type of identifier. It's going to be different depending on the type of data we're dealing with. So for instance, if we have an order that is new, comes through with an edit, we want to make sure that we apply that edit over the same kind of ID there. The other things that we kind of get out of the collections are some semantics around those requirements. So maintaining that sort order, even if messages come in, quote unquote, out of order as far as real time goes. Being able to keep up with any updates, edits, or cancellations and apply them to the correct messages and collections. We have a one-to-one where every input message is going to output the kind of updated state of the patient. We also keep track of that triggering message, so if we need to do any kind of like retroactive tracing back, we'll have access to that. And then finally, any of the new data that has been added to the patient aggregate gets tagged as well, so we can take advantage of that if we want to whenever we're applying those filters. So after we have the patient aggregate with all of the hydrated domains and the collections that are indexed and ordered in the way that we want, we have the feature factory where we can apply what we call PX forms, patient transforms, to pull out specific subsets of that data. Using this library to kind of have a declarative language allows us to, write the code once and then add the config as we want to kind of introduce new features or make changes. That really helps with scale as well as obviously development time. The configs get directly translated into transducers, and we have some like docs and semantics around that. And it makes it nice that the feature factories themselves are relatively simple services, and the library is really where most of the work is getting done. Here's an example of a feature factory config. Kind of the important part here is under collection instructions, we have an output key, and then the target is the collection that we're going to be pulling the data for that output key from. Within the filters vector, we have kind of the path that we want to apply some type of filtering to. Refinement allows us to narrow down on just the thing that kind of the filter hit on correctly. And then we have a few different comparison functions. This is a contains where we kind of check if one of these values is contained in the location that we're looking at in the target collection. Bit more of an fleshed out example. We have some other features like facility filtering. So if we only want to apply some type of extraction to some subset of our facilities, we have that opportunity to do so. And then the filters being a vector kind of has an implicit and operation to it. So as we add additional filters, we narrow down on the data until we have some specific feature that we want to generate and output. This is just kind of another example where we have even more filters kind of getting to a very, very specific and narrow definition. This really helps when working with like the clinicians and folks on the ground where they can give us, here are all of the things that we need in order to, get this output feature or have some type of data that's going to be actionable. And we can translate that into these feature factory configs. The other nice thing that we kind of mentioned already with this is we get a lot of scale out of this because they're all these self-contained feature factory configs, kind of avoid collisions across the keys, and we can just keep adding these configurations. Because we're running in Kubernetes, we have horizontal scaling if we do need to introduce more compute, but it gives us a lot of headroom to kind of continue building the pipeline as we get more and more data requests. Final step is feature delivery, so actually outputting that somewhere. As I mentioned, it's written to a few different places. We have output topics that some of our kind of working teams that we collaborate with read from directly. We have some internal topics where we do additional computation on top of them, and then we have the fax machine, which kind of writes all of that out to BigQuery. Again, kind of hammering this point home, but trying to keep as much consistency between the data that's available in the real-time feed and the data that's available at rest makes this actionable in whatever context we might need it. So at the end of the day, what we kind of have as our mission statement is enabling clinicians with the power of data. We already have a handful of use cases that we're, providing data for and continuing to build upon, but the open-endedness and extensibility of the platform really makes it a great candidate for whatever kind of on-the-ground clinical ideas we might come across. So teams can always come to us to deliver data, and we can usually try and find a way to get it to them. I think I'm going to pass it off to Derek to kind of go with the closing section about the impact of the Sojourner pipeline.
Thank you, sir. Alrighty, so I did want to talk a little bit about the impact that this has had at our hospitals. There's a bunch of use cases I could have chosen from. I picked 3 that I think are a good representative sample of kind of the capabilities of the platform, and also serve different use cases, so either enabling our doctors or our developers or our data scientists. The first is a product called Nate. So this neat little concentric circles view is actually a hospital. So Nate is a visualization layer that's used in all of our hospitals that shows, obviously the hospital itself is the biggest ring, and then, the wings of your hospital are smaller circles, and then the units of your hospital are even smaller circles, and then each smallest circle is a bed that is either has a patient in it or not. Nate can color the circles in a certain way, they call it an overlay, to highlight certain clinical conditions. And then you can click on it and drill down into specific patients. I'm not going to do that just because there's too much risk of data leakage. But in this case, this is showing the SOFA score. So the SOFA score stands for Sequential Organ Failure Assessment. It's a pretty complicated score that assesses how well 6 of your organ systems are functioning. And our clinicians can use it to triage things like ventilators and kind of focus in on who needs to be taken care of next. I think just looking at this particular overlay, you can kind of tell where the ICU is. The oranges and yellows versus more green being a lower SOFA score. So the SOFA score is a whole bunch of different data points. So I think there's 25 or so data elements that we sourced from Sojourner to compute the score. Everything from your PF ratio to your Glasgow coma score, which is how reactive you are to stimuli, how well your liver's functioning, whether you're on vasopressors, a whole bunch of different clinical domains as well. There's nursing documentation in there, lab results, medication administrations, all sorts of stuff. We actually initially deployed this as part of the pandemic, so the SOFA score was very helpful for our clinicians who were overwhelmed taking care of patients on ventilators, and it also helps with mortality risk stratification. So SOFA score is very, it's a good predictor of mortality risk. Second use is something called the Dynamic Discharge Dashboard. So I know this is I think it's probably a bit small, but hopefully you can see that in this particular patient card, so this is a card that represents a patient. A nurse would drill down into this during her day, his or her day, and there's some sections here for barriers and care goals and discharge barriers and that kind of thing. Believe it or not, you can be healthy and ready to go home, ready to be discharged from the hospital, but you might not be able to leave yet for various reasons. Either there's still an outstanding lab, so they have to wheel you down to the lab to have your blood drawn. You might still have a catheter in and you're waiting on someone to come take that out. You might be waiting on a ride. You might be not going home. You might be going to a skilled nursing facility or something like that, and they need to coordinate the transfer there. So there's all sorts of reasons that might hold up a discharge. That actually becomes very impactful on the ground because for every bed that's occupied by a healthy patient, that's a bed that can't go to someone who needs it if there's a ER volume that's building up. So this tool helps facilitate hospital throughput, so getting patients out of the hospital when they're ready to go home. And there's a whole bunch of different data elements. I don't remember the number. It's a pretty hefty volume, but of different orders that need to be chopped up in different ways to represent the different data sets for populating this tool. The last that I'll touch on is LLMs for nurse handoff. So this is actually something that we've been in a partnership with Google. This was unveiled at the Google Health Checkup, which this is a screenshot from earlier this summer. The goal with this was we worked with Google for about 2 months to fine-tune an LLM to summarize the patient record over the past 12 hours to facilitate the nurse handoff process. So what is the nurse handoff process? So when a nurse is coming off shift and a new nurse is coming on shift, there has to be a knowledge transfer there. So they each have to, the nurse who's coming off shift has to communicate, okay, here's what's going on with the patient. They need this drug at 2 o'clock. There are grandmothers in the room, this, that, and the other thing. That's a very, paper or verbal colloquial process right now. And I think the goal here is to have an LLM summarize the record to use as like a stable foundation that we could then use in the handoff process to increase patient safety. And Sojourner data was both used to train the model that we tuned with Google, as well as score to produce new summaries at time of shift change. So when shift change is coming up, we queue up a whole bunch of summaries to be generated, and then we serve them up at a couple pilot sites. Just some final thoughts. There are many more applications powered by Sojourner than what I just listed, and probably many more to come. But I just wanted to point out that we have ample room to scale. We have, transducers are very performant, and the way that we've orchestrated our Clojure microservices, I think the only limit is just how many Kubernetes clusters we want to pay for. But more than that, I think it proves that, not that anyone here needs convincing, but Clojure is more than just a toy language. It's a real tool that can help real large companies solve important problems. And I think, something like patient safety and patient health, there's really nothing more important than that to us. I did want to give a shout out to the HCA Clojurists. These are folks who are either a combination of lifetime Clojurists or folks who have had it thrust upon them. Just thank you to everyone who helped to build this platform. And I know that we all kind of espouse the motto of our founder, which is above all else, we are committed to the care and improvement of human life. So with that, that is the end of our talk, but if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them or can chat in the hall.